Okay, so before we get to our slideshow, I'm just going to do a walk back in time a little bit. So we've got what I call the diet dictocrats. They are the self-appointed watchdogs telling us how we should eat. And let's think about what they're telling us. They're telling us that the reason we have so much heart disease today compared to 100 years ago is because we've become a rich nation, bad, indulgent, eating all these animal foods full of saturated fat, and we didn't used to do that. That's what they're telling us. And not just for heart disease, but for many other diseases. So the healthy diet today is supposed to be a diet that has no saturated fat and has a lot of monounsaturated and polyunsaturated oils in it. Let's just define our terms. Saturated fats are fats that are solid at room temperature, and I'm not talking about this room. I'm talking about in the kitchen in the winter, okay? All the fats would be very soft in this room. So they would be butter, ghee, beef tallow, lard, which is pork fat, coconut oil, and palm oil. Those are the saturated fats. The monounsaturated oils tend to be liquid at room temperature, but if you put them into the refrigerator, they would get semi-solid. So the monounsaturated oils are olive oil, peanut oil, and canola oil. They're monounsaturated. The polyunsaturated oils are liquid even in the refrigerator. So that's corn oil, soybean, safflower, sunflower. Those are the polyunsaturated oils. And trans fats are oils that have been gone through an industrial process to make them hard at room temperature. Yes. It's on. It's on, but I haven't shown any slides yet. Okay. I'm just going to talk for a minute. Okay. So let's go back 100 years and look at how Americans were eating at the time. I have a little cookbook that was published in 1895. It's the Baptist Ladies Cookbook from Monmouth, Illinois. And it is a collection of recipes from the turn of the century. We know that people were eating these foods because it was all their favorite recipes, okay? And this book completely flies in the face of what the establishment is telling us, that the reason we have so much cancer and heart disease today compared to a century ago is because we are eating much greater levels of saturated fat from animal foods. So let's look at how people were eating back in 1895. Actually, it's like 120 years ago, right? Okay, so there's hardly a recipe in this book that does not contain butter, eggs, cream, or lard, beginning with the soup chapter and ending with all of the desserts. Most meat recipes call for gravy made with the drippings and occasionally with added cream. So none of the fat was thrown away. It was made into the sauces. Interestingly, it seems that in 1895, nobody had heard of al dente steamed vegetables. All the vegetables in this book are cooked a long time till they're very soft, and it seems like they were just an excuse for a sauce. The vegetable recipes include asparagus dressed in cream, 4 versions of cabbage with cream sauce, corn and eggplant fritters fried in lard. That sounds pretty good, actually. Potato balls fried in good drippings, and parsnips fried in bacon fat. So those are the vegetable recipes. One of the things that foreign visitors to America noted in the 1700s and 1800s was that America was a butter-eating nation. We ate huge amounts of butter compared to Europeans. Observers stated that in America, everything was swimming in butter, including porridge, soup, meat, vegetables, and pudding. We were a very rich land. We were a dairy nation. It was a grass-fed dairy nation, and no one was telling us that butter was bad. Everybody ate lots and lots of butter. Seafood recipes in this little book, 1895, include fish a la creme, scalloped fish, creamed salmon, and creamed fish. The sauce for broiled fish calls for 1 large spoonful of butter and 1 1/2 cups of cream. That's the sauce for the broiled fish. Interestingly, this Baptist Ladies Cookbook contains a whole chapter devoted to oysters, okay? Americans ate lots of oysters compared to today. We ate 2 to 3 times as many oysters per person in 1895 compared to today. Most of these oysters were canned. They were coming from the Chesapeake Bay, and it was a huge business. And some fresh oysters would come on ice by train to Chicago. Recipes for oysters include deviled oysters made with egg yolks, creamed oyster patties made with eggs and butter, oysters wrapped in bacon, scalloped oysters, oyster pie made with 1 quart of cream. 1 quart of cream, okay? Oysters fried in hot lard, and scalloped oysters made with butter and whole milk. There's a chapter on organ meats in this little book, which includes fried veal liver and sweetbreads, both creamed and fried. There's a scrapple recipe that calls for hog's head, heart, tongue, and part of the liver. How many of you have enjoyed scrapple? It's a real mid-Atlantic native dish, and we need to eat more scrapple. Scrapple is made with the scraps when they butcher the pig, head, heart, tongue, and part of the liver. And it was ground up, mixed with cornmeal, stored in a crock they put lard on top. And then to eat it, you sliced it and cooked it in lard for breakfast. And then there are separate chapters for eggs and cheese. Okay. Well, let's see what kind of salads they were eating in 1895. There's only one salad recipe that calls for lettuce when available, okay? Lettuce is a modern luxury. We eat lettuce almost every day. In the past, people only had lettuce during certain periods of the year, which leads me to my own particular theory of heart disease. It's caused by lettuce. Well, we're eating all this lettuce today. We have all this heart disease. We didn't eat lettuce in 1895. We didn't have heart disease, right? Okay. And you may laugh, but this conclusion is even more preposterous than the conclusion that saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease. And I actually have a very good explanation for my theory of why lettuce causes heart disease, which I'll explain to you later. The other salad recipes feature apples, cabbage, ham, tongue, chicken, oyster, fruit, potato, veal, lobsters, sweetbreads, shrimp, and nasturtiums. So we're making salads out of a lot of things, but it wasn't lettuce. The recipes for salad dressing are of great interest to our argument. What were they putting on these salads? The dressing for coleslaw features sweet cream. 3 recipes for salad dressing contain egg yolk, mustard, and vinegar. So they were using the egg yolk for the oil in these salad dressings, okay? 1 recipe calls for olive oil or melted butter. So they were putting melted butter on their salads. And another calls for a cup of whipped cream. So that's what they're putting on their salads. They were just excuses for animal fats. There's just 1 salad dressing recipe that calls for oil. This is the only time that we see this word oil all by itself. Oil is just coming in to the stores in 1895. The presses to create a vegetable oil were invented in 1890. And the first oil they made was out of cottonseed, the cottonseed left over from the cotton industry. And that was what they were trying to sell. Americans at the turn of the century nourished themselves with butter, cream, egg yolks, and lard, and they were not using vegetable oil, not yet. So in addition to eggs, butter, cream, lard, and suet, which is beef fat, and other animal fats like chicken and duck fat, coconut meat and coconut oil supplied additional saturated fatty acids in the turn of the century diets. Highly saturated coconut oil was used for crackers and baked goods, and it was advertised as being healthy. Now, the Baptists were fond of rich desserts. Half the book is devoted to cakes, pies, ice cream, pudding, and donuts. And the donuts were fried in lard, okay? 2 advertisements for dentists in the back of the book testify to the effect of sugar and white flour on their teeth. So their diets were not perfect, but cancer and heart disease were extremely rare before the turn of the century. People were sturdy and strong, but gross obesity was not a problem. Today, We are being told that saturated fats from animal sources and from the tropical oils like coconut oil are the cause of cancer, heart disease, and obesity. And vegetable oils are being used as a substitute in everything from baked goods to baby food. So what we're going to do in this presentation is focus on the history of how this came to be, how it was that Americans traded animal fats, that's what we were eating in the past, for vegetable oils and everything from baked goods to baby foods. And the title of this tall tale is The Oiling of America. Ta-da! So there's your slide. Okay. So again, we have the three main types of fat: saturated fats, monounsaturated oils, and the polyunsaturated oils. Let's move forward to 1921. This was the year of the first recorded myocardial infarction in the United States. Myocardial infarction means heart attack, sudden death from heart attack. Now, there was heart disease before that. It usually took the form of slow decline of cardiac function, and it was usually the result of a very bad case of typhoid fever. So about 10% of deaths up to this point were from heart disease, but not myocardial infarction. That's new. By 1930, there were 3,000 deaths per year from myocardial infarction, and by 1960, there were 500,000 from myocardial infarction. Just read an article in the paper the other day that said we're at about 650,000 deaths per year from myocardial infarction in the United States, and it just hasn't changed. It went down a little bit, but it's up again. And especially in young people, we're seeing these sudden deaths from heart attack in young people, as young as 25 years old. So we really have to go back to 1913 for the year of this big change. This is when Procter & Gamble came out with this product called Crisco. Crisco means crystallized cottonseed oil. And they published a book called The Story of Crisco. And this book is actually shown in advertising classes as a masterpiece of advertising. And basically they said that the women who used Crisco were more modern, more enlightened, they had cleaner houses, and they had children of better character than people who used lard. They knew how to push all the buttons of the upcoming middle-class housewife. She wanted to have wonderful children and clean houses. She wanted to be modern and enlightened, and that's what's, you could do that by using Crisco. So the industry has created the impression that it's somehow vulgar to cook with lard and that we should feel guilty for using butter. Well, what was causing this epidemic of heart disease? In the early days, the dietitians, which was a very good profession in the early days, it did a lot of excellent work. They said, well, we have seen one big change in the American diet, and that is Americans are not eating as much animal fat, and they are using these new oils. We think this is what should be looked at. But they were ignored, and what came out was the diet heart theory, or the lipid hypothesis of heart disease. And this was that Americans were eating this indulgent, bad, rich diet with too much cholesterol and saturated fat, and this led to us having high levels of cholesterol in the blood. And when you had high levels of cholesterol in the blood, that led to the buildup of plaque in the arteries, and that's what caused coronary heart disease. Well, when you have a theory in science and something comes along to contradict that theory, you need to go back to the drawing board and come up with another theory. And in 1936, a study was published by two Harvard pathologists which completely contradicts this theory. They looked, let's see if I can get this to work here. They looked at men who died sudden death. Oh, I'm sorry. And they looked at their cholesterol levels and the amount of fat or buildup in the artery. And they found no correlation. There were people with low cholesterol levels with a lot of buildup, and there were people with high cholesterol levels with low buildup. So there was no correlation between the level of cholesterol in the blood and the amount of buildup in the arteries. Okay? So this study disproved the theory that high levels of cholesterol in the blood is associated with atherosclerosis, but it didn't stop the promotion of this new theory. In fact, there was an organization formed specifically to promote this theory. Anyone know the name of this organization? The American Heart Association. That was their mission statement, was to promote the diet heart theory. And in 1956, the American Heart Association had a fundraiser which was aired on all 3 television networks at the same time. The program featured medical doctors, lots of frowny faces, sitting around promoting the lipid hypothesis and kind of lecturing Americans about their rich diet and suggesting that Americans should adopt a prudent diet, one in which corn oil, margarine, chicken, and cold cereal replace butter, lard, beef, eggs, and oatmeal with cream. Okay, so that was the prudent diet. Now, this campaign was not an unqualified success because one of the panelists was Dr. Paul Dudley White, who is considered the father of modern cardiology. Dr. White introduced the electrocardiogram to America, and he was President Eisenhower's physician. On public television, Dr. White noted that heart disease in the form of myocardial infarction was non-existent in 1900 when egg consumption was 3 times what it was in 1956 and when corn oil was unavailable. When pressed to support the prudent diet, Dr. White replied, "See here, I began my practice as a cardiologist in 1921 and I never saw an MI patient until 1928. Back in the MI-free days before 1920, the fats were butter and lard, and I think we would all benefit from the kind of diet that we had at that time, when no one had heard of corn oil." He said that on public television. But that didn't stop the promoters of the lipid hypothesis. The next step in this was the 1957, the Anti-Coronary Club. This was in New York City. It's a group of businessmen aged 40 to 59 who were placed on the prudent diet, and they had corn oil and margarine instead of butter, cold breakfast cereals instead of eggs, and chicken and fish instead of beef. Okay. The control group of the same age ate eggs for breakfast and meat 3 times a day. Well, the results were published in 1966, and the prudent dieters had lower cholesterol. It was average of 220 versus 250 in the controls, and so the abstract of this paper said this diet was a tremendous success. We got their cholesterol levels down. But if you read the whole report and read all the way to the end, and there was almost looked like a footnote, very tiny letters, you'd have to put your glasses on. And there you learned that there were 8 deaths from heart disease among the prudent dieters with lower cholesterol, and no deaths among the controls. So I would not call that a success. The National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute said, well, this study was too small to learn anything, and they said, we need a 1 million men diet heart study, and they started to organize this. They warehoused all the food, and they did it on the short term, and they found that the diet was worthless, and so this diet heart study was just abandoned without explanation. Well, they said it was for reasons of cost. Okay, so who was behind all this? I mean, the early evidence indicated that this theory was not a good theory, that it didn't work, that it was going to change people's diets for no reason. So who was behind all this? Well, it was this oil industry, this edible oil industry, which even in those days was extremely powerful. They had a big lobbying organization in Washington, D.C. You hear about the milk lobby and the meat lobby and the grain lobby, but you never hear about the edible oil industry. It's a very powerful lobby. In 1965, Dr. Fred Mattson, who worked for Procter & Gamble, made the American Heart Association. So the American Heart Association actually came out with a statement saying that maybe it's these new trans fats, and we should look at these more carefully. Well, the industry didn't want people to look more carefully, and so when Dr. Fred Mattson put pressure on the American Heart Association, and they just threw all those statements away and came out with a new statement which actually encouraged the consumption of trans fats. Then in the 1960s, this edible oil industry supervised, which means they got on the boards, of the American Heart Association, the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, and the American Dietetic Association. So they basically infiltrated and took over. In 1971, the FDA's General Counsel became president of the Edible Oil Trade Association. So the government official went to the trade association, and he was replaced by a food lawyer who had represented the food industry. He became the general counsel for the FDA. We call that the revolving door policy, okay? Then in the 70s and 80s, this same Fred Mattson had controlling positions, kind of backroom controlling positions in a big study called the Lipid Research Clinics trials that led to the National Cholesterol Education Program. So he was kind of manipulating behind the scenes. The American Medical Association opposed the lipid hypothesis at first. This was a press release, 1962. The anti-fat, anti-cholesterol fad is not just foolish and futile, it also carries some risk. They said this diet can't be done, it's even dangerous to try. But by 1972, even the American Medical Association came around. They'd been influenced, supervised, and three important organizations, the American Heart Association, the American Medical Association, and the National Academy of Science, all came out with statements, official policy statements about heart disease, were obviously written by the same person. They were almost identical. And number one was that Americans had cholesterol that was too high. Our cholesterol was too high, undesirably elevated, and it was important to lower cholesterol levels. They called for routine measurement of cholesterol levels in physical examinations. Cholesterol is a very large molecule, and it was one of the first molecules that we could actually measure in the blood. So we had machinery to measure it. We had labs that could do this. And so, you know, if these labs want to make money, you want to have everybody getting their cholesterol measured. The dietary advice, Americans in the risk category, whatever that means, should receive appropriate dietary advice, whatever that means. That's what these statements said. Well, they did say that Americans should reduce the consumption of saturated fats by substituting polyunsaturated vegetable oils. Okay, so this was American Medical Association, American Heart Association, National Academy of Science. Use vegetable oils, not animal fats. And then all three statements had this interesting paragraph: modified and ordinary foods useful for this purpose should be readily available on the market, reasonably priced, and easily identified by the appropriate labeling. Any existing legal and regulatory barriers to the marketing of such foods should be removed. And then they said, but we need more studies. We need more studies to determine whether modification of plasma lipids, that means lowering cholesterol, can reduce heart disease. So basically they're calling for the wholesale change, not only in our diets, but in the whole practice of medicine, for a theory that hasn't been proven yet. Well, the barriers, let's see, let's get my little pointer here. The barriers to the marketing of these new foods. What were the barriers? Well, the barrier, there was one particular thing. It was the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938, which said that a imitation food had to be labeled as an imitation. So the industry had figured out how to make something that looked like cream out of vegetable oil, but they had to put the label imitation on it. They figured out how to make something that looked like eggs and something that looked like meat. You know, they were working on all these modified foods, and they didn't want them to be labeled imitation. That was a barrier to selling these foods. And Americans didn't want imitation foods, especially after the Second World War. Well, remember that, what's his name? Let's see. Peter Barton Hutt, excuse me, I forgot his name for a minute. Peter Barton Hutt had gone to the FDA. He was a food lawyer. And as soon as he got there, he got rid of this imitation policy, and it was all done in a very underhanded way. And this policy attempted to provide for advances in food technology and give manufacturers relief. It wasn't for us, it was for the manufacturers. And give manufacturers relief from the dilemma of either complying with an outdated standard or having to label their new products as imitation. Since such products are not necessarily inferior to the traditional foods for which they may be substituted. The regulation defined inferiority as any reduction in content of an essential nutrient that is present at the level of 2% or more of the USRDA. So that meant that if they were making imitation cream out of vegetable oil, as long as they added artificial vitamin A and any nutrients that were lower in the artificial food and brought it up to what was in the real food, they didn't have to label it as imitation. And this really brought in the synthetic vitamins. This is when they started adding synthetic vitamins to bread and to milk and all of these products. The next step in this saga was the Senate Select Committee in Nutrition and Human Needs. You can just see somebody's in the background planning all this out. And this was chaired by George McGovern, who believed in the lipid hypothesis. There were thousands of pages of dissenting testimony. They were all ignored. And the final report claimed that USDA data showed that animal fats cause and vegetable oils prevent cancer and heart disease. Now, at this time, my dear colleague, Mary Enig, a late colleague, Mary Enig, was a graduate student at the University of Maryland studying fats and oils, and she was very familiar with the USDA data. And she said, but the data doesn't show this. So she did a FOIA request, Freedom of Information request, and she got the data that the McGovern Committee used. And when she got this data, she saw that they had really played fast and loose with this data. They had left out big chunks of data. In one place they added where they're supposed to have subtracted, and all to get this conclusion, whereas when she looked at this data was telling her that people still eating animal fats had less cancer and less heart disease, and the people eating the vegetable oils had more cancer and more heart disease. And she was able to publish this in an obscure journal, which when the article came out got a lot of publicity. Every major newspaper talked about her article. Even the National Enquirer had an article about it. So a few weeks later, she was called into her professor's office at the University of Maryland, and the whole department was there, the professors, the graduate students, and 4 representatives from industry. There was someone from Kraft Foods, Procter & Gamble, Central Soya, and the Institute for Shortening and Edible Oils. And one of them had, this was before the internet, he had a clipping service. He had a big stack of all these newspaper clippings. And he was furious. He said, we don't like this article. We watch the journals to make sure that only articles favorable to our industry get published. Now, that is an amazing admission. And I thought my colleague was watching that journal, and he thought I was watching, and we let the barn door open and a horse got out. He said, this is not going to happen again. He said, Mary at the time was doing a paper on how much trans fats was in the food because nobody knew, the government wasn't watching. And he said, if you continue this research, we're going to cut off all your funding. And you just can't do this. We have the power. Basically said, we have the power. So Mary did continue her research. She actually published an article about where the trans fats were in the diet. And all their funding was cut off. Even funding from the dairy industry was cut off to the University of Maryland. And as the professors retired, they were not replaced, and that whole department was shut down. Mary herself never got any research grants when she when she graduated. So in spite of Mary's brave efforts, the trend continued. The report and all the publicity that went with it continued these dietary trends to more vegetable oils, less animal fat. But the medical profession was still skeptical of the value of cholesterol-lowering measures. Well, what I'm going to show you next is 3 studies, actually 4 studies, that were used. They published a little booklet, and they had some references in the booklet, and these were the references they used to make the argument that we should be changing our diet and worried about our cholesterol and everything. And the first was the 40-year Framingham study that looked at risk factors for heart disease in this little town of Framingham, Massachusetts, and they concluded, drum roll, that it was cholesterol levels in the blood. And this was the final chart that was published in the American Heart Journal, major journal. And basically it looks like, especially if you're a man, if your cholesterol gets up here, between 265 and 294, suddenly you're very much at risk for heart disease. Suddenly at risk. Now, I don't know how well you can see this, but what's really kind of squirrely here is the intervals. The first interval is from 84 to 204, 121 points. The next intervals are all 30 points. And then the last interval goes from 295 to 1124, so 830 points. Okay. Now, if you were a student studying statistics and you did that in a final exam, you'd get an F. That's not right. I redrew the graph with equal intervals of 100 points each, and now it looks very, very different, doesn't it? Yeah, the risk for heart disease goes up a little, but it's nothing to get frightened about, even up here at 1,000. Even if your cholesterol is at 1,000, you're really not much more at risk for heart disease. And in this circle, which goes from 185 to 384, the vast majority of the population, this is a straight line. You really can't see. If there is an increase, it's so small that you can't see it. And yet, Dr. Stamler, who was pushing all this, he said, so the actual rate of increase was 0.13% between 182 and 244. Again, you can't even see it here on this line. He said that's a 240% increase in risk. So how did he turn this tiny, tiny increase into such a big, scary number? And he did it by inventing a new concept called relative risk. And here's how it works. Suppose the death rate from heart disease, if your cholesterol is 240, is 2 per 1,000, and if your cholesterol is 160, it's 1 per 1,000, okay? So the difference in rate is 1/1,000th. But this new thing they're calling relative risk is 100% different because 2 is 100% greater than 1. You see what they've done? They've gotten rid of the denominator, okay? And now suppose the death rate from heart disease, if your cholesterol is 240, is 2 per million, and if it's 160, it's 1 per million. The difference in rate is 1/1,000,000th, but the relative risk is 100%, because 2 is 100% greater than 1. You see what they've done? They've gotten rid of the denominator, okay? Now, you may not have taken statistics in high school or college, but you all took fractions, and if you had done that on your fractions test, you would have gotten an F, okay? But they get away with this, and basically, most published studies in prestigious journals exaggerate the benefits by reporting them in terms of relative risk, and minimize the side effects by reporting them in terms of absolute risk. Okay? This study was published a few years later by the director of this Framingham study in a very obscure journal. And he said, really, what happened in Framingham was the more saturated fat one ate, the more cholesterol one ate, the more calories one ate, the lower people's cholesterol, blood cholesterol. We found that the people who ate the most cholesterol, the most saturated fat, the most calories, weighed the least and were the most physically active. So that's what they really found. The second big study that they did that was, to justify all these changes was the multiple risk factor intervention trial, Mr. Fit for short. They have come up with really clever names for these. And this one, we have equal intervals here, okay? So no problem there. And we see that the deaths from heart disease, they do go up as the cholesterol levels go up. Not a lot, but they do go up. And this is total deaths. And here you find this very strange thing, which shows up in so many of these studies, that even though heart disease deaths are lower at low cholesterol, all-cause deaths are higher. So this comes up over and over again. There are more overall deaths if your cholesterol is low than if it's high. And these deaths come from cancer. Number one is cancer, but intestinal diseases, accidents, and suicide. So they are all higher when your cholesterol is low. Now, I don't know about you, but frankly, I'd much rather go with a quick heart attack than a long fight with cancer or be so depressed I committed suicide. Also, strokes were higher, which is also not a good way to go. Now, John LaRosa, in talking about this study, made a statement that the curve starts to inflect at 200 milligrams. So when your cholesterol is at a level of 200, the curve starts to inflect. This is 200 right here. Okay. Now, I think he means by inflect that this is going to go up at a higher rate. But if you were looking at this line and you were going to pick a place where suddenly you're more prone to heart disease, where would it be? Well, there's no place you could pick because it's so gradual. But they were kind of priming everybody for this number, 200. They wanted people to start to think that that's where you're at risk if your cholesterol's over 200. The last was the Lipid Research Clinic's coronary primary prevention trial. It was a very expensive trial in those days, $150 million. It was not a diet trial. One group was on a cholesterol-lowering drug and one was on a placebo, but all of the subjects were put on the prudent diet, low cholesterol, low saturated fat. In fact, big part of this budget went to dietitians who met in focus groups with all the participants and told them how to cook in vegetable oil, eat breakfast cereals, and so forth. When the results came out, the researchers claimed that the group taking the drug had 17% reduction in heart disease. But independent researchers, that's Mary Enig and her group, got the data. They found no difference in heart disease between those taking the drug and the placebo groups. The average cholesterol reduction was 8.5%, which had led to the often repeated statement by Rifkin, for each 1% reduction in cholesterol, we can expect a 2% reduction in heart disease events. And this is just complete nonsense. The group taking the drug actually had more deaths, and these were from cancer, stroke, violence, and suicide. Well, the media had a field day with this study. It came out in 1984, and I do remember all the hoopla in the magazines about we finally have our answers. We finally have the proof that animal fats are the cause of heart disease. And the study didn't even look at animal fats. It was looking at this one drug. And by the way, a few years later, there was a study of Framingham Revisited. They went back and looked at the subjects in Framingham, Massachusetts, and they found that for each 1% drop in cholesterol, there was an 11% increase in coronary and total mortality. So basically what they're finding is that the low cholesterol is not a good thing. There's just higher mortality with low cholesterol. Then there were the epidemiological studies, and the most famous of these researchers was Ansel Keys, who kind of built a whole career on this. This was his 6-country study. And you can see that we have 6 countries, and this is the percent of calories from fat. Doesn't say what kind of fat, and these are the deaths per 1,000 from heart disease. And gosh, this looks like such a perfect match. We have Japan and Italy down here, and England and Wales, Canada, Australia, and then the naughty people in the United States eating all those animal fats. And this is almost too good for, for biology. Biology doesn't really come out this nice. So before I show you what he did, I do want to comment on Japan and Italy. Now, in Japan, it's very dishonorable to die of a heart attack. And it's very dishonorable to have patients who die of a heart attack. So there's a lot of deaths from stroke, and that's what they put on the death certificate. So the family is not dishonored by the type of death, and the doctor is not dishonored by the type of death. So the statistics from Japan are extremely unreliable, Japan and China. And then he says that the Italians were eating a low-fat diet. And he went to Italy right after the war when the Italians were eating a low-calorie diet because they were starving. There was not much food. And I guess he never ate fettuccine Alfredo or, pepperoni pizza or anything, because he came back convinced that the Italians had a low-fat diet. But even putting all these little niggling questions aside, this was the data that Dr. Keys had available at the time. Okay? And basically what he did, he drew the line that he wanted, and then he picked the countries that hit that line, and then he just took all the others away. Yeah, right. Keys also found some very interesting country pairs. So, for example, in Finland, people tended to have high cholesterol, and in West Finland, they had very low rates of heart disease, and in North Karelia, they had very high rates of heart disease. And there were similar pairs in Middle Europe and Greece and Italy. Very, very interesting. Why the difference in rates of heart disease when the cholesterol levels were pretty similar. But nobody went back to look at that. It just kind of let go, and now it's too late. I believe this study was in 1970. It's really too late now because, things have changed in these countries. This was the Monica study, where except for China and Japan, which have low rates of cholesterol and apparently low rates of heart disease, where these death certificates are very unreliable. Everybody else is over here. And here we have France with high levels of cholesterol and low rates of heart disease. That's the French paradox. So, everybody else is over here and you really can't make any conclusions. But in Sweden, they took this Monica study, and this is how it was published in the newspaper. Okay? So they just left all these points out, and they just kept 3 in: Japan, Sweden, and Finland. 1 point from Finland, North Karelia. And that was the time when they were doing a big push for margarine in Sweden. So basically what they did is just use 3 points and left all the others out. And these were some interesting results. And now this is 2005. I realize this is a few years ago. But what they found, these were the countries with the lowest saturated fat consumption, and they had varying rates of heart disease. These were the countries with the highest rate of saturated fat consumption, and they had relatively low rates of heart disease. Starting with France down here, here's your French paradox: high levels of cholesterol, low rates of heart disease. But look, we have a Swiss paradox, a Dutch paradox, an Icelandic paradox, Belgian paradox, Finnish paradox, and Austrian paradox. All of these paradoxes, and as Galileo said, by denying scientific principles, one may maintain any paradox. Well, all this built up to the National Cholesterol Consensus Conference, which was convened in 1984. Now, if you put yourself back at this time, there was a tremendous amount of criticism of the National Institutes of Health because there were so many dissenters. There were at least 30 or 40 scientists who were writing, this is just baloney, it doesn't meet with the facts, it's a bad diet. And so they invited all the dissenters to the conference. It was designed to appear objective and comprehensive, and they were allowed to speak, but their views, their talks were not included in the panel's report. Their names were there, but not their views. Okay. Mary Enig attended this conference with a colleague, and the colleague picked up somebody else's papers by mistake on the first day, and there was the final report. It was written before the conference was convened. All they wanted to do was fill in one number, which is what was the risk point. Was it cholesterol levels of 200? Was it 210, 220, 230? What was it? And Mary, who seemed to be at the right place at the right time, overheard an argument between the organizer of the conference, Dr. Rifkin, and two of the other organizers, and the two were saying, well, it's got to at least be 240, that's the average. And he said, no, we have to make it 200, otherwise we won't have enough people to test and to treat, okay? So that's how this number, 200, was defined. If your cholesterol was over 200, you were at risk, and you were going to get the cholesterol-lowering drugs and the prudent diet. That sounds really scientific, doesn't it? Okay. The report called for mass cholesterol screening. And by the way, let me say that today, that number is even lower. If you go in and you've had any health problem, any kind of heart condition, you're put on a cholesterol-lowering drug no matter what, because obviously your cholesterol is too high. Okay. It recommended the prudent diet, low in saturated fat and cholesterol for these at-risk Americans, even though no long-term studies had ever been done of such a diet. And a specific recommendation in the cholesterol consensus report was the replacement of butter with margarine. So now this was government policy that we were going to eat these industrial seed oils and not eat butter. And this launched the National Cholesterol Education Program. It had actually begun a year before. The stated goal was to change physicians' attitudes, and your tax dollars paid for a large physician's kit sent to all doctors. The American Pharmaceutical Association was on the coordinating committee, so you can imagine that some of these recommendations had to do with drugs. The dietary recommendations included reducing cholesterol and saturated fat, and specifically to use margarine instead of butter. Now, in 1990, the NIH added something else. And by the way, during all these years, people were looking at what children needed for growth, and had learned a lot about the role of cholesterol and fats for growth. But in 1990, the NIH recommended the prudent diet for all Americans above the age of 2. So if you took your 2-year-old into the pediatrician, the pediatrician would say, okay, your baby's 2, we don't want the baby to have heart disease, so no more butter, no more whole milk, no more, not many eggs, the breakfast cereals are fine, and give your kids margarine and low-fat milk. Okay? This is more than bad advice. This is genocide. This is genocide, and our children are paying the price for this. They did pay, and they're paying today. We're seeing this incredible health crisis, and it's coming from this bad advice. This is what motivates us. I figure, well, the adults, we've reached adulthood, adults can figure this out for themselves, but the children are innocent victims of this. This is what motivates the Weaton A. Price Foundation. Our number one audience is young women of childbearing age, so we can get this information to them. Don't believe it, that's not the type of diet that you need to have healthy children. I'm going to skip these two slides because it's a lot of small print. Interestingly, there were many other studies at the time that completely contradicted the diet heart theory. One was the International Atherosclerosis Project, which looked at 31,000 autopsies from 15 countries, and they found no correlation between animal fat intake and the degree of atherosclerosis or the serum cholesterol level. They found just as much blocked arteries in vegetarians as meat eaters, and they found meat eaters that had clear arteries, so they just found no correlation. And there were also a number of others that came out right about this time that completely contradicted the diet heart theory. And many, many critics. George Mann, who'd been a director of the Framingham Project, he said the diet heart theory has repeatedly been shown to be wrong, and yet it is still pursued for profit and prejudice. The public is being deceived by the greatest health scam of the century. Michael Gurr, who wrote the definitive lipid biochemistry textbooks, said after he retired, "Whatever causes heart disease, it is not primarily a high intake of saturated fatty acids." So we call this the oiling of America. So you can see what's happened since 1909. This is to 1985, but things are pretty similar today. Butter has gone down, way down to 5 pounds per person per year. They're putting this in grams per day. Okay, so that's a teaspoon per day. Lard is plummeted, use of lard is plummeted. They actually go into the Hispanic communities and try to stop them from using lard. The dietitians go in and say it's not healthy for you. Shortening tripled, and margarine. But look at the liquid oils, okay? The 16-fold increase since 1909. Where are they using these liquid oils? What are they putting them on? Lettuce. That's why lettuce causes heart disease. It's because they're the salad dressings that they're putting on them. And we know there is a copious scientific evidence that these polyunsaturated oils are just bad news. They increase cancer and heart disease. They're very aging. They cause wrinkles. They disrupt the immune system. They cause prostaglandin disruption, liver damage. They're particularly damaging to the reproductive organs and the lungs. These are the two sites, most frequent sites of cancer in America. They cause digestive disorders. What we're really concerned about is the effect of these oils on children, growing children. They depress learning ability, they impair growth, and they lower cholesterol. And children need that cholesterol for their brains and their guts. This is an advertisement for Wesson oil, and you can write in and get a complete cholesterol depressant menus and recipe book. Where did this appear? Well, this was in the Journal of the American Medical Association. Yes. Here's one for margarine, corn oil margarine, for high blood pressure. And there is just no evidence at all that corn oil margarine or any kind of margarine is going to bring down your blood pressure. It's just zero evidence. This is a flow chart about how margarine is manufactured, and you can say, well, we're not eating margarine anymore, and that's true. But it's still, these trans fats are still being used, a lot of them in fast foods, so in the fryers and so forth. So the first step is to extract the oils from the seeds. They use very high pressure and temperature. What comes out of those seeds looks like black gunk. You could never imagine that it's edible. Then they use hexane, which is basically gasoline, to get the remaining oil out of the seeds. Now everything is steam cleaned. That removes the vitamins and antioxidants, but not the pesticides and solvents. They're still there. The oils are mixed with finely grated nickel, powdered nickel, and then they're put into this reactor, which is as big as this barn, and under high temperature and high pressure, they bubble hydrogen in. And in the presence of this nickel catalyst, the molecules are rearranged. What goes into the reactor is liquid oil. What comes out looks like gray cottage cheese. Okay, it's full of lumps, and there's these hard places and sort of softer places. So then they add emulsifiers to smooth out the lumps. The oil is steam cleaned again to remove the horrible odor. I mean, this stuff stinks to high heavens. And then the gray color is removed by bleaching. And at this point, what you have is called, right here, pure vegetable shortening. And this is what's used in the fryers. It's used in the cheap cookies and the icings and anything that you want to have be hard or stable. That's where it's used. To make the margarines and spreads, they add artificial flavors, synthetic vitamins. They are not allowed to add artificial color. They have to add a natural color. It's comforting. And then it's packaged in blocks and tubs. And because this stuff is so cheap to make, they have lots and lots of money for advertising and for influencing university researchers and so forth, and government officials. In writing my book, Nourishing Fats, I came across, and by the way, all of this is in the book, Nourishing Fats. I came across this ad, and I think this is from 1970, and it's a heart wrapped in Fleischmann's margarine wrapper, and it says, "Eat to your heart's content." So, and if you read the text, it is so syrupy about how margarine's going to protect your heart and so forth. And these hydrogenated fats are rearranged molecules that actually stop reactions on the cellular level, and they are associated with all sorts of things: cancer, heart disease, degeneration of the joints and tendons, osteoporosis, diabetes. I mean, the list goes on and on. They cause infertility, they lower sperm count, and again, in the children, failure to grow, learning disabilities, low birth weight babies, reduced visual acuity, reduced fat content in mother's milk, so her milk is not as nourishing. And I showed this earlier, but just remember, the liquid oils cause uncontrolled reactions on the cellular level. The solid, partially hydrogenated, inhibit reactions in the body. So you're going to get chaos on the cellular level. Well, as you know, a few years ago, the government said, you know what, we made a mistake. These trans fats are really bad. Like we've been telling you, these trans fats are really bad. I mean, they made it seem like, oh, just a little mistake, okay? And they said they're just as bad as saturated fats. So they used what came out about the trans to continue bashing the saturated fats. But in fact, the saturated fats have very different properties from the trans. For example, the saturated fats support and enhance hormone production, whereas the trans fats interfere with hormone production. Saturated fats help the insulin receptors, whereas the trans fats inhibit the insulin receptors. The saturated fats are very good for the immune system. They enhance the immune system, and the medical profession knows this, because when you've had a heart transplant, first thing they tell you, don't eat saturated fats because you will reject your heart, because they enhance the immune system. And the trans fats depress the immune system. So this is the kind of thing that came out, the bad fats brothers, the sat and trans. So they basically used the bad news about the trans to continue bashing the saturated fats. And this was from a World Heart Federation. Open your eyes to saturated fats, basically comparing butter to razor blades. I was invited to speak at a policy discussion at Windsor Palace a few years ago. Jeffrey went with me, and the guy from, I had 20 minutes to say all this in 20 minutes, and I just was talking as fast as I can. And the guy from the World Heart Federation, he was so angry. Oh, he was really mad at me. And here's one: open your eyes to saturated fat. So, big attack on cheese. Who's afraid of saturated fats? It's blamed for everything: diabetes, clogged arteries, causing, makes you fat, etc. And none of this is true. And I did show you this slide earlier. The saturated fats, if you actually look at the biochemistry of the body, saturated fats are needed for everything. Everything from your mitochondria to your lungs to your hormone production. And if you don't eat saturated fats, your body has that backup plan, which is to make them out of carbohydrates. And so you will crave carbohydrates. So think of the paleo diet, which has no fat, it's lean meat, and no carbs. It is an extremely dangerous diet. Well, for the past, it's almost 100 years, we've seen this increase in heart disease and cancer. We don't know all the reasons. We don't have all the answers. But one thing for sure, it's not butter, because butter is going in the opposite direction. There are many good things in butter. We're the butter people. We want you to love butter and foods that contain butter, like cheese and whole milk, because butter is a sacred food. It is the healthiest fat on the planet. Butter is the fat in nature for the growth of all mammals. Whether you're a whale or a human, butter is the fat. And there can't be anything wrong with it. One interesting study was published in 1965. These were high-risk patients who'd already had a heart attack, and they were divided into 3 groups. They were told to consume either polyunsaturated corn oil, monounsaturated olive oil, or saturated animal fats. Well, the corn oil group, they were a success. They had 30% lower cholesterol. Success. But only 52% alive after 2 years. The olive oil group had only 57% alive after 2 years. The animal fat group was by far the best, with 75% alive after 2 years, and these were high-risk patients. Okay, let's just turn our attention very briefly to cholesterol. What is cholesterol? It's often called a fat, but cholesterol is not a fat. It's a sterol. It's more like a wax. It's made by almost every cell in the body. That tells you something. We need cholesterol. Its key role is to make cells waterproof, so there can be a different chemistry inside and outside the cell. It is nature's healing substance. It repairs wounds, including tears in the arteries. If you have very weak arteries, your body's going to make a lot of cholesterol to be there to shore up those little wounds and things. It gives structural integrity or proper stiffness to your cells. Cholesterol in the animals and humans plays the same role as cellulose in plants. It is the precursor to vitamin D. We make vitamin D out of cholesterol in our skin. We make bile salts out of cholesterol, and bile salts are what we need to digest fats. They're made out of cholesterol. Hormones, sex hormones, protective steroid hormones, they're made out of cholesterol. And cholesterol is a powerful antioxidant that protects us against free radicals in the cell. And finally, it is essential for the development and function of the brain and nervous system, and needed for the proper functioning of the serotonin receptors in the brain. Serotonin is a feel-good chemical. And when our cholesterol is low, these receptors don't work very well. And depression, violence, suicidal behavior are all associated with low cholesterol. And as we said earlier, cholesterol is the mother of all hormones, all the sex hormones, all the healing hormones that help us heal and deal with stress. They're all made with cholesterol. So, summary of cholesterol research. Cholesterol levels increase naturally and gradually with age. This is normal. It's just like women tend to gain a little weight with age. This is normal. This is protective. As we age, we need more protection against free radicals and carcinogens and so forth. It's very difficult to get an accurate reading. Cholesterol levels vary with the amount of stress you're under, the time of day, when you last ate, and the type of test used. Now, men are at a slightly greater risk of heart disease if their cholesterol levels are over 300. So and this is if you're under 60. So how many men in this room are under 60 and have cholesterol levels over 300? Nobody. Okay. It's rare. Okay. They are a little bit more at risk. But there's no appreciable difference in the rate of heart disease for cholesterol levels of 180 to 300. So that's the vast majority. In women and the elderly, the higher your cholesterol, the longer you live, the longer the lifespan is. So as you age, you really want your cholesterol to go up. And autopsy studies, as we said, show zero correlation between the estimate animal fat intake, the degree of atherosclerosis, or the serum cholesterol level. What about HDL and LDL? You know, HDL is supposed to be the good and LDL is supposed to be the bad, but there's actually very little evidence that LDL is bad. LDL has a very important role in the body. It carries cholesterol and nutrients to your cells. It feeds your cells. What we do know is there's more deaths at lower total cholesterol. There is one kind of, well, let's say this, the cholesterol in your food is not bad and really has very little relationship to the cholesterol levels in your blood, but we know that oxidized cholesterol is bad. And oxidized cholesterol comes from things like powdered milk, powdered egg yolks, and then in the animal fats used for deep frying. And so these may build up a plaque in the arteries. Cholesterol-lowering drugs do not lower the risk of heart disease, but they do increase the risk of cancer, intestinal diseases, depression, suicide, and violent behavior. What a deal. Talking about LDL cholesterol, there is a way of measuring buildup in the arteries, and what builds up in the arteries is not cholesterol. It is calcium going to the wrong place. And they can see the calcium by something called electron beam tomography, which correlates strongly with total plaque volume, strongly with the degree of obstruction, and is a strong predictor of heart disease events. And this is LDL cholesterol. Okay, this is LDL cholesterol. This is calcium buildup. And there's very little correlation, but there's actually a slightly negative correlation between, so higher LDL is a little bit protective. That's what it's showing. So, in fact, a new study, this is 2013, came out and found that higher LDL cholesterol was associated with a longer life. Higher LDL in subjects over 50 was associated with lower all-cause mortality. Amazing, isn't it? Not what you don't read that in the newspaper. So there are actually over 200 risk factors for heart disease. These include something called lipoprotein a, homocysteine, type A behavior, loss and bereavement, not always, but are often followed with a heart attack, short stature, low birth weight, elevated uric acid is a very strong risk factor, elevated something called C-reactive protein, low vitamin D, underactive thyroid, lack of exercise, obesity. We know these ones. Snoring, smoking. We can do something about lack of exercise, obesity, and smoking. We know these are risk factors. Snoring. It's a risk factor for heart disease. Baldness, hairy chest, earlobe creases, hairy earlobes, being poor in a rich country and being rich in a poor country, and elevated cholesterol in some population groups. The point is that a risk factor is not a cause, and lowering people's cholesterol because it might be a risk factor for heart disease is sort of like cutting somebody's earlobe off because it's got a crease in it, or because it's hairy, okay? Or shaving your chest, okay? It just doesn't make sense. And we've seen some of the ways they cheat. I'm not going to go through all this, but there's just a lot of ways that they can cheat on this statistical data. There's a really great gal named Zoe Harcombe right now. Any new study that comes out, she shows, how they're cheating. So, and I took this photograph in the Raleigh-Durham Airport, which is the research triangle where a lot of these studies are done. And it says, lucky you don't have to worry about results when Quintiles handles your clinical trial. So you're a young doctor, you've just come away with $1 million grant, but you're a little bit worried because you know the results that they want, and you want to make sure you get those results so you get another grant, and here you see this ad. We can help you. We can get you the results. Okay. And maybe I can work with this beautiful woman too. She looks foreign too, yes, right. So, all right, so the cholesterol-lowering drugs, the drugs used today are called statins. Now, the earlier drugs that they had made everybody nauseous, so everybody, no one could stay on them. But the statins didn't do that. They work on an enzyme that reduces the production of cholesterol in the liver, and there's a lot of different names, Lipitor, Zocor, so forth. They were discovered by the Japanese, who found them to be very toxic in animal trials. And so they said there's no possible use for this, and they sold their discovery to Merck, who got FDA approval with unexplained speed. In every rodent study, statins have caused cancer. I think you really need to think about this. Lowering cholesterol is a risk factor for cancer. And they're currently being promoted for healthy men and women, categorized as at risk because they have cholesterol levels over 200 or even lower. We had experience, I'm sure many of you have had this experience with a loved one in a nursing home, and we could not stop them from giving him a statin. He had low cholesterol anyway, quite low, like 150. And we just could, my daughter was sort of in charge of all this, and every time a new doctor would come on, he'd prescribe a statin. And we'd explain that we don't want him to have a statin. It makes him tired and brain fog. And we'd turn around, and the next week the statin was back on there. So it was almost impossible to keep the statins out. They just give them to everybody. And they have lots of side effects. Fatigue and weakness, memory loss, reduced mental capacity, sometimes very severe memory loss, neuropathy and slowed reactions, muscle wasting leading to back pain and heart failure. The heart's a muscle. We've had heart failure rates have increased greatly since they started the statins. Intestinal disease, pancreatic problems, reduced libido, depression, accident, suicide, cancer. So if you don't believe me, go to askapatient.com and just put in Lipitor and see what people are saying about the side effects. It causes increased rates of heart failure, and the statins reduce the body's production of coenzyme Q10, which is what we need for our muscles to work. And this is why you get the weak muscles, the back pain, and so forth. Statins also block the absorption of vitamin A, which we learned is so important. One very important study, and this was published in The Lancet, looking at changes in cholesterol concentrations over 20 years with all-cause mortality. Our data accords with previous findings of increased mortality in the elderly with low serum cholesterol, and show that long-term persistence of low cholesterol concentration actually increases the risk of death. The longer you have low cholesterol, the greater your risk of death. Thus, the earlier that patients start to have lower cholesterol concentrations, the greater the risk of death. And these findings have been corroborated in other studies. This is a Lipitor ad implying that slim young women as well as hefty men should be taking Lipitor. And I'll just read you the fine print. Lipitor is a prescription drug used with diet to lower cholesterol. Lipitor is not for everyone, including those with liver disease or possible liver problems. How do you know you have possible liver problems? Women who are nursing, pregnant, or may become pregnant. We had a letter from a gal who was under a lot of stress. Her cholesterol went up, and the doctor said, well, we'll just put you on Lipitor. And she said, but we want to have another baby. Oh, he said, once you get pregnant, we'll just take you off the Lipitor. But it's too late. Lipitor is a very strong causer of birth defects. And, you know, these could be caused in the first weeks of pregnancy before you know you're pregnant. So they're very cavalier. Lipitor has not been shown to prevent heart disease or heart attacks. It will prevent cholesterol anxiety, but it will not prevent heart disease or heart attack. Now, actually, this is old, and since this time, the FDA does allow them to claim that Lipitor prevents heart disease and heart attacks. Well, if it ain't cholesterol, what causes heart disease? We first look at Weston Price, who believed that it was a deficiency of fat-soluble vitamins, A and D. He noted that there were more heart attacks during the period when these vitamins were lower in the butter. But there's many other theories: refined carbs, trans fats, too much vegetable oils, too much omega-6, oxidized cholesterol, and all kinds of deficiencies. Heated milk protein. There was one doctor who was convinced that pasteurization led to more heart disease. Homogenization and coffee consumption, thyroid deficiency, lack of exercise, stress, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all kinds of theories about what causes heart disease. But it's very hard to get money to study these theories because the National Institutes of Health is really, you know, into the lipid hypothesis. I'm going to skip this one. So, who profits? This is a huge industry, $100 billion a year. And then all of the foods that they want us to eat, that's actually America's biggest industry. The cancer industry, caused by the cholesterol lowering, that's a huge industry. And then growth failure and learning disabilities in children. You actually can't even put a monetary figure on that. So this is my recipe for a healthcare crisis and enormous profits. The ingredients are greed, envy, ignorance, manipulation, cunning, extortion, lies, and fraud. Step 1, conspire to convince the populace that natural whole foods that have nourished mankind for millennia, such as eggs, butter, whole raw milk, and red meat, are dangerous and unhealthy. 2, train the medical profession to advocate antibiotics, vaccinations, fluoride, and fabricated foods as scientifically proven methods for preventing illness. 3, ignore or suppress healing methods that work, claim that real diseases have no cure or do not exist. So if you've got fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue and there's no pill for that, right, and you keep coming back to the doctor, honey, this is all in your head. We're going to give you an antidepressant. Okay. And finally, define normal human conditions such as menopause. Remember when they made a disease out of menopause? Okay. And average cholesterol levels as illnesses which must be treated with expensive drugs that create serious side effects. Then you stew, broil, half bake, or boil as the occasion requires, and this serves 300 million people. And that is the oiling of America. Thank you. Thank you. So we have a lot of articles at our website. Unfortunately, this cholesterol and health has been taken down, but the Ravenscoff's website still has a lot of good information. And my book, Nourishing Fats, goes into this in great detail. And of course, the Weston A. Price Foundation is your best friend. Dr. Price's dying words were, you teach, you teach, you teach. So that is our mandate. We are here to teach and to provide the information you need to be healthy. All right, thank you.
I want to thank you, Sally, for coming out today. And this is a basket of goodies from all of us at Churchtown Dairy. And yeah, thank you. Thank you for coming. We do have time for questions. Yes, yeah. Well, I'll hold it for you. We got it. There we go.
Yes.
What's your opinion on avocado oil?
Avocado oil is an okay oil. It is a monounsaturated oil, and I actually wrote a blog recently on all those other oils, and that one is okay. Yeah. Well, I prefer the animal fats for cooking. because you still get some breakdown. In fact, I just saw a recent study that was kind of alarming about cooking in olive oil, and it wasn't good. So I think we should cook with the animal fats. Yes, in the blue shirt?
We hear about, I hear about cured meats, okay? I love smoked meats. What about the nitrates and nitrates? What's your opinions there?
Yeah, I think you should minimize the nitrates and nitrites, but there's a lot of nice cured meats available today that don't have those in them. And they're going to be more expensive, but that you will be supporting local artisans. What was the name of our salami? Charcuterie, which is a local company that's making beautiful, beautiful salami and that kind of thing. Okay. Yes.
This may be a controversial question for some people. How did you wake up about the dangers of vaccination? Because many think that it's completely safe and it's healthy. That's very controversial.
Yeah. It's a question about vaccinations. How did I wake up to the dangers of vaccinations? And I did not vaccinate my children. It was just, well, let me say this. I had a smallpox vaccination when I was a child, and it was the most horrible thing ever happened to me. I screamed bloody murder. They had to hold me down, and I had a bad reaction to it. And that experience never left me. And then when my brother was about 3 years old, he developed meningitis, and he almost died. They had to take him to the hospital. And I can remember my brother's in the middle of the bed. He's shriveled up like half his size. The ambulance is coming. I remember my mother standing there crying, and she said, "I just don't understand it. He was at the doctor yesterday for his polio shot, and the doctor said he was fine." It was a picture of health. I'll never forget that. And that just stuck with me. I associate seeing my brother like that with the polio shot. And when I was raising my kids, there was not a lot to read on this. I just had this gut feeling. But the first person who wrote books on this was Neil Miller, and thank goodness. And then the other books started coming out. So it's not like you have to depend on a gut feeling. The science is there. Yeah. It doesn't mean you need to be careless about your child's immunity. You need to feed them a good diet. You know what to do. Need to know what to do when they're sick. But vaccination is not the way to do this. Not the way. Yes.
Wouldn't the oil in tree nuts recommend the paleo diet as
Well, tree nuts depends on the nut. Walnuts have a lot of omega-3, and so they go rancid really quickly, and you have to keep them in the freezer. Pecans and almonds are monounsaturated, so they're sort of like olive oil. They're pretty safe to eat. And remember, when these oils are inside the nut or the seed, they're way more protected than when you squeeze them out. Then they're not protected. And I think things like cashews is a little bit more unsaturated. So each one has a different profile.
But it's the case that a paleo diet is not receiving kind of adequate fat from those oils.
No, because first of all, you're not getting your fat-soluble activators from them. And secondly, there's not enough saturated fat. See, the paleo diet is lean meat, okay? And no traditional culture ate lean meat. They knew it would make them sick. The paleo diet also doesn't talk about organ meats at all. And I really can't even understand that. I mean, obviously, the Paleolithic people ate the organ meats, so yes. Yes, in the back.
What do you think about Italian buffalo cheese?
Italian buffalo cheese? Well, I don't know much about it, but if it's a whole milk cheese, I think buffalo milk is pretty high in fat, just so long as it's not made of skim milk. Yes. Rice bran oil. Okay. We all know what rice bran looks like. Think of how hard it is to get the oil out of that. It's not oily, so it has to be pressed at really high temperatures. They have to use hexane. It's a way of getting the oil out of a waste product, and it's a highly processed industrial oil. Yeah, so I would not use it. In traditional cultures, the rice bran, and they did hull the rice in Asia. They had little grinders, and they took the hulls off, and the bran went to the chickens. And then they ate the chickens and the eggs and got all those wonderful vitamins. But they weren't eating the rice bran themselves. Yeah. Really, that's the only one I recommend for your salads. And then cook in lard, bacon fat, butter. Yeah. So flax oil has a lot of omega-3, and we tend to have a lot of deficiencies in omega-3 in this country. And so those recipes all had a little bit of flax oil added. What happened is people started overdoing it on the flax oil, and they were eating tablespoons of flax oil, and you can get too much omega-3. So a little bit, and it needs to be kept in the refrigerator because it's very fragile. Yeah. Yes.
Go over again the 300 cholesterol. I didn't understand the 300 cholesterol level on men over.
Okay, men under 60 with cholesterol over 300 are slightly more at risk for heart disease. Under 60. Over 60, you're free and clear.
What do you think about when people are telling you to eat calcium-rich foods and they say to eat yogurt? Now, yogurt, if you buy the best quality yogurt that you possibly can, like Bellwether or the black sheep yogurt, is that not any good because it's pasteurized? I mean, what do you think?
I think it would be really a lot better to buy Churchtown Dairy raw milk and make low-temperature yogurt. And yogurt is originally a drink. In the Middle East, yogurt is a beverage, a salty beverage. And that's the way I think we should be eating yogurt. Kefir is good. And kefir is so easy to make. That's what I would do with the... yeah, exactly.
And what about, like you were talking about the 1890s, were those people eating raw, unpasteurized butter?
Yeah, they were. Absolutely. They didn't have... Pasteurization started to come in the 1920s. First mandatory pasteurization was 1948.
What's your feelings on raw eggs and also raw milk?
Pardon me? Raw eggs? Okay. Raw eggs, I think the raw yolks are fine. The raw whites really are difficult to digest. So if you're doing your smoothies or whatever, I just put the yolk in there. Raw meat, I'm a big advocate of raw meat. And I have a whole chapter on raw meat in Nourishing Traditions. And my go-to meal, if I'm feeling a little bedraggled, is steak tartare with raw egg yolk and onion and capers. And pepper and salt. So yes, I'm a big advocate of raw meat. All traditional cultures ate some of their meat raw. Yes.
We hear about dairy products being mucus forming. Can you explain where that comes from?
Well, first of all, if we didn't have mucus, we'd be dead. We have mucus-producing membranes, and they're supposed to produce mucus, okay? I think what they really mean is that they might produce too much mucus, okay? Or I think most people think when they hear that, mucus producing, they think, oh, I'm going to get a cold. That's what they think, okay? That's not my experience. In fact, we know that raw milk protects against respiratory infection. But I think everyone if you drink raw milk and you just become overwhelmed with mucus, but I don't think most people have that experience.
But regarding salmonella, eating raw eggs, is there any scare? Is there any precaution?
Yeah, I wouldn't eat raw egg yolks or raw eggs from the supermarket. Yeah, I wouldn't.
Coconut oil, how much is too much?
How much what?
How much coconut oil is too much?
Oh, okay. My experience with coconut oil is about a tablespoon a day is all I can eat, and I start to feel nauseous. So I think you'll get a signal how much. Yeah. Yes.
Are there any elements of elements of pasteurized milk that actually work to destroy the artery wall?
Well, there were some theories about that. there was this guy named Anand in England who noticed that the villages that had pasteurized milk had more heart disease. So it's possible. Certainly we saw that in the pasteurized milk, the calcium goes to the soft tissues. The arteries are soft tissues. Yes?
What are ways to find a doctor that would listen to you?
There are doctors who do. And, I mean, they're not listening to me, but they're, they've come to their own conclusions. And I would contact your nearest local chapter leader because they know where the good doctors are.
The doctor that was sitting next to me earlier today, here to hear you.
I'm sorry?
You had to leave early, but the man is sitting next to me right here, the doctor.
Oh, okay. Yeah, they're out there. Yeah, so they don't always take insurance, so.
Do the people that you advocate purchasing raw milk from go through certain processes to make sure that the raw milk is okay?
Well, you have to ask. You have to ask how they do. And but the thing that's interesting to me is since we've been keeping records in 1960, how many deaths have there been from raw milk? 0. And most of that milk is totally unregulated. We have no idea what the sanitation was. But that just shows you it's such a protective food. But I think the way we do it today with, stainless steel and testing, I mean, just no risk. It's wonderful. Yeah. What is the question? Well, I'd go to the farm. I'd ask to see the milking shed. I'd ask to see, do they have hot water on the farm? I think that's a good question. Yeah, I think it would be good to have hot water. So yeah, you can just tell when you come to a farm, are they clean and neat? And look at this milking parlor here, it's just spotless. It's just amazing, yeah. Yes?
But I want to say I got my raw milk from a neighbor farm in New Hampshire for 40 years, and they might as well not have had hot water because they took the milk from the cow in a bucket, they brought it into the house, and they had a rough strainer to get any hay that happened might be on it, and they clean off the udder, and they poured it from there into the jars that I bought. That was it. And it was such a short process. There was very little chance of major contamination. But you need to, the biggest thing is knowing the farmers. That's why there should be many, many, many little farms, so that everybody will know their farmers, the one they're getting the milk from. This alienation of the food is the problem in all respects.
In New Zealand and Italy and many parts of Europe, you can get raw milk in vending machines.
Vending machines.
So I'm fascinated by how science has been used to deceive people so much. And I'm wondering if any of this scientists or reports have been brought to task, if there's been any lawsuits, if anybody, like this happening with the pharmaceutical companies now, if anybody has gone after these studies.
I don't know of any, except, writing about them and critiquing them. As I say, Zoe Harcum is doing really good work today. Every dietary study that comes out, she analyzes it. So it's a membership thing. You have to pay a little fee to get her reports and emails. But she is really good. Zoe Harcum. Really, no. They doesn't get to the papers until it becomes a huge scandal like Vioxx, and then it gets into the papers. Or Roundup is now finally getting into the papers. So this is why you need to be informed. Be a member of the Weston A. Price Foundation. We really do keep people informed. We have a section which I love to write called Caustic Commentary. And see, I was brought up to be a sweet Southern girl, and I couldn't be sarcastic, which I love to be sarcastic. So I can be sarcastic in the Caustic Commentary. And I go through a lot of this stuff that's coming out. Yes?
How did you first find out about the work of Dr. Weston Price? Especially since it was so suppressed back then even today, up to today, and there's still a lot of people who don't know about Dr. Weston Price and his declaration.
I don't think it was suppressed. It was just not known. I read his book in the 70s. I'm a big reader, and I was interested in nutrition. You almost can't avoid it, but I ran across him in the Yes bookstore in Washington, D.C. And this was, so already, I love to cook. I was using all the butter and everything. And reading Dr. Price kind of confirmed me on this journey. And then as the low-fat dogma started to take hold, it was like, oh, something has to be done about this, because you just can't let them get away with it. So that was my feeling, yeah. Okay, so, Dr. Price not only wrote about nutrition and cavities and everything, he also wrote about root canals. His only child, a boy, died of an infected root canal that he had put in. He had a tragic life, and he wrote 1,000 pages on root canals and found that if you took a root canal tooth from an animal with heart disease and embedded it in like a rabbit, that new animal would get heart disease. So those root canal teeth are never sterile, they're never clean, and there's all sorts of horrible anaerobic bacteria that breed in there. So we do recommend people not get root canals, and that they actually remove root canals. Yeah, well, he stepped on a lot of toes, a lot of toes.
Somewhat related question. How important would you say it would be to remove a mercury-filled tooth?
How important to remove a mercury-filled tooth? I think if you're having health problems, I would get rid of the tooth or get rid of the mercury. With a dentist who knows how to do it.
So with all of this research, what's the why? Like, why are we being fed this bullshit?
I think it's because the vegetable oils are so profitable, and they're cheap, and so you can make processed food cheap. If we insisted on having all our processed food made with butter and lard, there would not be any profit in it for them.
Neither in a healthy population.
Pardon me?
A healthy population isn't profitable.
Yeah, a healthy population isn't profitable either. As Rhett Butler said in Gone with the Wind, "Ma dear, there is more money to be made from the destruction of civilization than building it up." So, there's a lot of money to be made. This is a war on us. I think they deliberately don't know. They don't want to know.
I see a lot of people do this. I don't do it. A lot of people put aluminum foil on a baking sheet, or they cook with aluminum. That's very toxic. Would you agree?
Yes, although we do have a mechanism for keeping aluminum out that we ingest, and that's our good gut flora. What we don't have a mechanism for is getting rid of the aluminum that's injected. Okay, yeah. Okay, last question.
Not a question. Sally, thank you so much for all that you do. I did not need to be here because I've seen it all from you on YouTube over the years. And thank you to the Churchtown Dairy for having you here so I could come somewhat close to home and see you in person, my guru and mentor from afar.
Thank you. And thank you, Cam. Thank you, Abby. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. That was a nice note to end on. Thank you so much.